Hello, I'm Heather Hewitt, welcoming you to Old Parliament House in Canberra for the fourth lecture in our series Prime Ministers on Prime Ministers. To mark the 70th birthday of this fine old building, which is now a political museum, Prime Ministers, past and present, have been invited to give their views on the top job. So far, we've heard from John Howard, Malcolm Fraser and John Gorton. And tonight, the guest is Gough Whitlam, who's celebrating an anniversary of his own. It's now 25 years since his Labor government was elected in 1972. And of course, just 3 years later, his term ended when he was sacked by the Governor-General in the most controversial of circumstances. To introduce him tonight in the Old Parliament House dining room, here's Warwick Smith, representing the Minister for Communications.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Warwick Smith, standing in for Senator Richard Alston, who's overseas, and I extend a very warm welcome to you. Particularly, I acknowledge the presence of the Speaker, other parliamentary colleagues, distinguished guests. This is the fourth of the Prime Ministers on the Prime Ministers series, and we certainly welcome all of you here to this very historic building, the Old Parliament House, which is celebrating this year its 70th anniversary. Over the past few months, we have heard from Prime Minister John Howard and from former Liberal Prime Ministers Malcolm Fraser and Sir John Gorton. 25 years ago yesterday, Gough Whitlam led Labor to power for the first time in 23 years. Now, one day after that anniversary, Gough Whitlam, the 21st Prime Minister of Australia, will once again rise to speak in this historic building. Perhaps more than any other Prime Minister, we associate Old Parliament House with Gough. Gough Whitlam's enthusiasm to set his program in place once he became Prime Minister meant he did not want to wait a fortnight or more for his ministry to be formed. So he had himself and his deputy, that great Tasmanian, Lance Barnard, sworn in as a two-man government. I think it's great to have a Tasmanian there like that. They began work in earnest on issues as diverse as recognising China, ending conscription and pulling troops out of Vietnam. And Gough, as a young man, you also took off the sales tax on contraceptives. It was, Gough, the beginning of a dazzling reform program that saw an astounding amount of legislation passed during the government's first weeks in power. A crisis over the passage of budget bills through the Senate resulted in the events of the 11th of November 1975. And many I know, including myself, were present on that day. Perhaps the most controversial period in Australian politics. The Whitlam government lost office, and after a brief time as opposition leader, Gough Whitlam resigned from politics in 1978. The Whitlam era was a rollercoaster ride for both those in Canberra and those watching. Today, there is recognition across the political divide that Gough Whitlam remains one of the giants of Australian politics, a statesman who brought great wit, energy and intellectual vigour to parliamentary debate in our nation. Gough has loomed large in Australian life since the late 1970s, and he continues to draw immense interest, as we have seen through this absolute sellout crowd here tonight. Gough, we warmly welcome you and Margaret to this historic location for this historic address. But also, we extend a very warm welcome to your family and grandchildren who are assembled here tonight. They can, as many Australians are, very proud of a leader such as you. Ladies and gentlemen, E.G. Whitlam.
Minister, Mr. Speaker, monarchists, Republicans, pseudo-monarchists, crypto-Republicans, and, by courtesy of the ABC, this time with the board's approval and the minister's approval, men and women of Australia. May I compliment the Prime Minister on his idea for this series and thank Richard Alston for his letter outlining the excellent staff arrangements for Margaret's and my participation. A fortnight ago, Margaret got a bit of a fright when I came home and told her, "You know that nice relative of mine, Richard Alston, who gets tickets for the opening nights at the Opera House? Well, he cannot come on the 3rd of December, but we are to be welcomed by that young up-and-coming minister, Warwick Smith." She was visibly shaken. I reassured her, no. He's not making us sell up and move into a nursing home. In fact, he's presiding at the dinner at Old Parliament House. He'll help us up the steps where I made that speech. And he'll put us up at the Canberra. You remember, that's the place where John Gorton and I drove up on our wheels to rededicate it as the Hyatt. Happily, my contribution to this series on Prime Ministers, celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Old Parliament House, coincides with my arrival here 25 years ago today to set up my first government. Among the unusual, some might say unique features of the first Whitlam government was the fact that it operated for its entire duration from the 5th to the 18th of December 1972 from the office of the Leader of the Opposition in this building. So, ironically, did the first Fraser government 3 years later. My associations with this place extend almost to the beginnings, well before I became a member of the House of Representatives 45 years ago. My father came to Canberra as Deputy Crown Solicitor in 1927. The first time I observed a Prime Minister was in 1928, when our class at Tilapia Park School was taken to see the House of Representatives in action. Our teachers didn't deem it suitable for us tender 12-year-olds to be exposed to the Senate. The only occupant of the government front bench was the Prime Minister, Stanley Melbourne Bruce. He was sprawling on it and wearing spats. The next time I observed the Prime Minister, or at least one in the making, was in 1929, when my parents went for a holiday in Sydney, and I was staying near the school at the Wellington Hotel, now Ridge's Capitol Hill. I was doing my homework in the lounge on the 12th of September. Suddenly, the Labor members trooped in to celebrate the defeat of the Bruce Page government, one of the 3 occasions in this building on which a government lost its majority in the House of Representatives. We never did. The Wellington Lounge was in high spirits while the Labor members waited to board their carriages, railway carriages, for Sydney and Melbourne, and thence to their electorates for the elections. The only ones sober were Jim Scullin and his wife, both teetotalers. Prohibition in Canberra had ended in December 28, and the Wellington was not licensed till May 1930. But the bar in Parliament House provided saloon and takeaway service from its opening on the 27th of May 1927. I never saw Joe and Enid Lyons at close quarters. They were the first parents to live at the lodge. Their last child, the 12th, was born in October 1933. At Canberra Grammar School, we noted that 9 months earlier, Lyons had been recuperating at the lodge from a broken leg. Latham, John, not Mark, had to act as Prime Minister. Lyons was the first Catholic to be a Conservative head of the Government of Australia. He still holds that distinction. The Australian head of state, to whom all parliamentarians must pledge allegiance after they are elected each time, has to be a member of the Church of England. Margaret and I have fond memories of Dame Enid. After dining with us during the celebration of International Women's Year in Canberra in 1975, she wrote that for the first time since she had left the lodge 36 years earlier, she had been made to feel at home there. I never met John Gorton, but I came to know his widow well. In April 1967, I was in the then unprecedented position of being a new leader of the federal opposition under threat from his party's power broker in Western Australia. I was immensely reassured by a letter from Elsie Curtin, still a highly respected and influential figure in Labor circles in that state. To my astonishment, she observed that Margaret and I must be celebrating the 25th anniversary of our wedding, which had taken place on the 25th anniversary of her own. Her view is held, and sometimes expressed, in the Whitlam household that wives of Prime Ministers are more highly regarded and widely loved than Prime Ministers themselves. I don't think it's so funny. Perhaps tonight I should only pay public tribute to the wives of my predecessors or opponents, although I may venture the thought that if her generation had enjoyed the opportunities for women provided by my government, Margaret might well have been speaking in this series in her own right. It is a fact that in my time, all Australian Prime Ministers have been fortunate in their wives, and Australians have benefited from their influence. Allow me to mention just our 4 predecessors and immediate successors. When Robert and Patty Menzies came to live in the lodge for a second time and an unbeatable term, they irrevocably made this city not only a splendid national capital, but the greatest of Australia's inland cities. The Aged Persons Homes Act, 1954, was the idea of Dame Patty, a senator's daughter. Dame Zara Holt brought a zest and flair to life at the lodge. She was amused to find, in 1966, that they had inherited a gramophone. It played only 78s. I may have exaggerated a bit during the credit squeeze of 1960 when Harold Holt was Treasurer in noting the paradox that Australia's worst planner was married to Australia's best designer. Bettina Gorton, an American by birth, used her Indonesian language skills to make a valuable contribution to Australia's relations with our great neighbour. Sonia McMahon continues to grace many good causes in Sydney, especially in our district, where 3 ex-Prime Ministers now reside. A Vice Reign recognised Tammy Fraser's elegance and discretion. She graciously gave the wife of the Australian head of government permission to call her by her first name in private. Yet, no matter how good the wives, it is a salutary thought that no Prime Minister who served in this building retired at a time of his own choosing, with Menzies Mark II being the exception which proves the rule. Setting aside the caretakers, Page in 1939, Ford in 45, McEwen in 67, all save Menzies, second time round, were deposed, defeated, dismissed, or died in office. Lyons, Curtin and Holt died in office. Bruce, Scullin, Chifley, McMahon and Fraser were defeated at elections. Menzies Mark I fell victim in 1941 to what Arthur Coles described as the UAP lynch mob. Within 2 months, Fadden, who, as he himself said, reigned 40 days and 40 nights like Noah's flood, was voted out by Parliament. Gorton was voted out by his party and himself. I was ambushed. Only 4 of us, Scullin in 1929, Lyons in 32, Menzies in 49 and Whitlam in 72, went directly from Leader of the Opposition to Prime Minister as a result of an election victory. The Menzies ascendancy of his final years tends to obscure the unevenness of his remarkable career. It is, for instance, almost forgotten that he presided over Australia's record inflation. That was in 1952, and it helped me considerably in the Werriwa by-election. Only Labor's maladroit distribution of seats in the enlarged House of Representatives in 1948 saved Menzies from electoral defeat in 1954. And only Labor's maladroit campaign saved him from electoral defeat in 1961. The most fervent anti-communist will now scarcely defend the Communist Party Dissolution Act 1950 or the referendum which he lost in 51. The fondest imperialist will scarcely defend his role in the Suez fiasco of 1956. Some of you will remember the doyen of the press gallery in those days, Ian Fitchett, political correspondent, as the title then was, of The Age, and then the Sydney Morning Herald. Fitchett's grandfather was the Reverend Dr. W.H. Fitchett, the author of many books of an uplifting nature, written for the youth of the British Empire. His magnum opus was published exactly a century ago, in 1897, when Menzies was 3. It was entitled Deeds That Won the Empire. In the course of one of their regular sparring matches, just after the British disaster over Suez in 1956, Menzies said to Fitchett, "You'll never write anything as good as your grandfather's Deeds That Won the Empire." "No," said Fitchett, "but you've inspired me to work on the sequel, Deeds That Lost the Empire." Menzies was, by any measure, a superb advocate in the House and on the hustings. He freely acknowledged that not only did he simplify, but he oversimplified. The most effective yet egregious example was his exegesis of America's war of intervention in Vietnam and Australia's participation in it. It was, he explained, to stop the downward thrust of China between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Menzies retired while the war was still popular. In the 10 years, almost to the day, between the Australian commitment and the fall of Saigon in April 75, the next 4 Prime Ministers, Holt, Gorton, McMahon, Whitlam, had to cope with this particular legacy of Menzies. Menzies at least was not responsible for the advertising graphics of the 1966 campaign, which showed huge Red armies thrusting down from China through Vietnam to the heart of Australia. I like to think he would have disdained such crudity. I must confess that I didn't expect to see in 1990 an Australian Prime Minister personally identify himself with comparable imagery, misrepresenting in this case the nature of Aboriginal land claims. As I suggested earlier, it is a myth that the Menzies era was one long stately progress. Problems abounded and accumulated. I mention one aspect of the Menzies approach to the problems of his time because it typifies what I believe to be our most serious national failure. Menzies was the undisputed master of many positive political skills, but he was also masterly in procrastination. Who had taken a lower priority, he would shelve the report and forget the problem. This, for example, was the fate of the Constitution Review Committee, 1955-59, and the Vernon Committee of Economic Inquiry, 1963-65. This feature of the Menzies decades has remained as prominent in the last 2 decades. These years provide abundant examples of the folly of ignoring or postponing a problem in the hope that it will disappear or diminish. Federal and state governments use the federal system and the electoral systems to justify postponement and excuse inertia. Too often, national solutions are postponed pending agreement of the states or pending the next election, in a country where the major parties are always preparing for the next election. The inevitable consequence is that the problems accumulate and intensify. It is especially timely and appropriate to raise these matters in this building tonight. The great achievement of the first Parliament to meet here, the 10th Parliament of the Commonwealth, was to revolutionise the public borrowing system and to place Commonwealth-state financial relations on an entirely new footing. Prime Minister Bruce and the Premiers signed the financial agreement on the 12th of December 1927. The agreement was ratified by Parliament in 28 and by the people by referendum on the 17th of November 28. The referendum, held concurrently with the general election, was carried by large majorities in every state, the only referendum to do so until the 1967 referendum, giving this Parliament power to make laws with respect to Aborigines. The financial agreement made the Commonwealth responsible for state debts and established the Australian Loan Council. With the exception of uniform income taxation, introduced as a war measure by the Curtin government, the Parliament has made no greater reform in Commonwealth state financial relations in the last 70 years. Now, exactly 70 years after the financial agreement and 50 years after uniform income tax, the High Court's rejection of the state's excise taxes on liquor, tobacco and petrol makes a third revolution in federal state finances. For 40 years, in opposition and government and subsequently, I have asserted the proposition that the central problem of our federal system is the imbalance between functions and finances. At the end of the 20th century, the provision of health and hospital services is a supreme example of that imbalance and the distortions which arise from it, including the distortions, indeed contortions, of the tax system. The present Prime Minister notwithstanding, the fiscal priority of our time is not the imbalance between direct and indirect taxation, it is the imbalance between the financial resources of the Commonwealth and the states, the functions they perform and the services they provide. It cannot be claimed that hospitals are traditionally and intrinsically state responsibilities. They accounted for minuscule proportions of government expenditures by the federating colonies in 1901 or by the states, even when Parliament moved here 70 years ago. It is inevitable that federal involvement in hospitals will increase, just as it has in the case of universities. The outstanding achievement of Sir Robert Menzies, his best legacy. His initiative on universities was the model for mine on schools. In 1946, Prime Minister Chifley successfully put to the people a referendum which gave the Parliament the power to provide medical and dental services. In the case of hospitals, my government commenced a 5-year program of capital assistance for the provision, expansion and modernisation of public hospitals. A joint hospital works council was established in each state to coordinate the use of state and federal funds. Premiers of both sides of politics cooperated. Federal participation was terminated in 1978 and the program has never been restored. The High Court's decision on state taxes poses the problem with renewed urgency. Federal legislation to collect the taxes and then pass the revenue back to the states cannot be more than a stopgap. No federal government will concede that state governments can spend federal revenues better than the federal government can spend them. Instead of passing the buck, as well as the bucks, we must pass the functions. Specifically, the state parliaments should delay no longer in transferring their remaining responsibilities in health and hospitals to the federal parliament. But the initiative, the leadership, must come from Canberra. It is not necessary to get agreement from all the states. That's standing excuse for postponing action. Any one state can make an agreement with the Commonwealth to transfer its hospitals to the Commonwealth. Agreements with the other states would quickly follow. It is the one breakthrough which can best prevent the breakdown, not just of the nation's public hospital system, but of the federal system itself. History will place the Prime Minister who achieves it in the very front rank of Australian Prime Ministers. Hospitals represent the clearest case where the problems inherent in our federal system should be a spur to Prime Ministerial action, not an excuse for postponement and delay. No feature of our system militates more against good governance. No feature more diminishes the capacity of Prime Ministers and Cabinets to plan for the long term than the fact that we have too many elections. Australia has more elections than any comparable country. Their multiplicity and frequency inflict increasing damage on our political and economic processes. The escalating cost of campaigns is the main potential source of political corruption. The four Prime Ministers after Menzies had to cope with his legacy on Vietnam. All his successors have had to cope with this other legacy, his refusal to act on the recommendations of the Constitutional Review Committee concerning the Senate and the rights of Aborigines. His successor, Holt, submitted referendums on both to the electors in May '67. The first was made urgent when, after the 1961 elections, the Menzies government lost its majority in the Senate. The latter was made urgent when the United Nations in 1965 adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The Labor Party, now led by me, strongly supported both referendums. The first referendum was approved by only 40.25% of the electors and by a majority in New South Wales alone. The second obtained a record majority in all states, 4,650,000. Holt was Prime Minister for 23 months. His immediate successors, under state pressure, abandoned both issues. My government submitted referendums on the Senate but obtained majorities in New South Wales alone. It secured the passage of acts with respect to Aborigines in accordance with the 1967 referendum and the 1965 Convention. In 1982, the High Court, for the first time, heard evidence and arguments on behalf of Aborigines in a state. The Aborigines won all the cases. Kuwata in 1982, Mabo number 1 in 1988, Mabo number 2 in 1992, and Wick in 1996. The present government is pursuing legislation to bypass these High Court decisions and the UN Convention. It may be said of Sir Robert Menzies that he held too many elections and too few referendums. Our federal constitution envisaged a holding of elections every 3 years. Until 1949, elections were in fact held every 3 years. At Westminster in 1911, the Parliament Act forbade the House of Lords to reject or hold up money bills. In Washington, in 1845, the election date for federal officials was fixed as the Tuesday after the first Monday in November in even-numbered years. By the end of the century, the state legislatures, Melbourne Cup Day, yeah. By the end of the century, the state legislators had adopted the same election date. Senators in the US continued to be elected by the legislatures of the states until 1913, when the 17th Amendment provided for them to be elected by the people of the states. Since then, the same date has been used to fill the vacancies for senators, who have fixed 6-year terms, for presidents and governors, who have fixed 4-year terms, and for congressmen and state legislators, who have fixed 2-year terms. The President, Senate and House of Representatives may all propose different annual federal budgets. After much toing and froing, a single budget is passed and all elected persons complete their terms. If Menzies after 1949 had copied the provisions of the Parliament Act 1911 and the 17th Amendment 1913, Australia would have been spared many of the traumas of the ensuing years. The opportunistic use of the Prime Minister's right to dissolve the House of Representatives, which Menzies used in 1955 and 63, threw the elections for the two houses out of kilter. That caused the separate elections for half the Senate in 1964, 67 and 70. It also meant that no senators were elected concurrently with the House of Representatives in December 72. And that was the root cause of the subsequent difficulties. In 1975, 83 and 87, there were double dissolutions on spurious or faulty grounds. The parliaments elected in 90 and 93 were the first to run the full 3 years since the parliament elected in 1958. We must now recognise that the multiplicity of discontinuous elections in Australia is not a manifestation but a manipulation of democracy. All the states, except Queensland, have now adopted 4-year terms. In all the states, except Western Australia, the Legislative Council cannot reject or hold up money bills. The Labor and Liberal parties should now set a goal of holding the elections for all federal and state houses of parliament on a fixed date every 4 years. They should repeal section 394, subsection 1 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918, which prohibits state elections being held on federal election dates. They should promote referendums for a 4-year term for both federal houses and a referendum to prohibit the Senate holding up supply. It has never rejected supply. I acknowledge that under the Westminster system, the right of a Prime Minister or a Premier to call an election for the lower house almost at will is deemed to be an indispensable prerogative. Yet when the proposal for fixed terms was put to the electors of New South Wales by the Fay government in 1995, the electors removed that right by an overwhelming majority. The Prime Minister with whom I had the closest association was Harold Holt. I saw him on every sitting day for the 6 years that I was Deputy Leader of the Opposition and he was Leader of the House. I learnt more about Parliament from him than from anyone other than Menzies. When he became Prime Minister, he had visited more countries than any of his predecessors. He did have a vision about Australia's future in Asia. The vision was lost in Vietnam. During the Vietnam hostilities, in which Australia was involved but Britain was not, Holt quietly dropped the Cross of St George from the RAN ensign and the British roundel from the RAF ensign. My fellow Republicans are anxious that the issue of the flag should not be allowed to confuse the substantive issue of the Republic. I shall therefore content myself with this observation, that on all the great public occasions in this city, before World War I, between the wars, and during World War II, the dominant flag was always the Union Jack. If a gesture was ever made to Australian as distinct from imperial patriotism, it was by showing the Australian red ensign. That is, the flag of the British Merchant Marine with the Southern Cross and the Commonwealth Star added against all the rules of heraldry. In 1944, Menzies inaugurated the Liberal Party in Albury in front of the Union Jack, alone. In 1944, my squadron interred coffins at Yokala wrapped in the Union Jack, alone. The idea that the present blue national flag has profound patriotic associations from the world wars is a myth. Holt knew when changes were needed in a wide range of issues. His successors should emulate him. Harold Holt's successor, John Gorton, was the first coalition Prime Minister to take a constructive view of the role of the Commonwealth in relation to the states. More than anything else, intransigent premiers of his own party, backed by their state machines, undermined him as Prime Minister. Our political parties are still largely based on state organisations. The most incompetent and irresponsible premiers come from the states which have been the slowest to democratise their legislatures. Their attacks on the High Court show that they have no understanding of the role that the Supreme Courts of the United States and Canada, the High Court of Australia, and the Constitutional Court in Germany must fulfil in federal systems of government. The High Court is not like an equal opportunity tribunal, which is established by statute and can be disciplined by the executive or discarded by the legislature. It is shameful that such premiers should publicly pressure a Prime Minister to discriminate against the aspirations of their Aboriginal electors and in favour of the aspirations of pastoral and mining stakeholders who are much fewer in numbers and are substantially foreign. Since the elections in March last year, there has been an unprecedented infusion of young talent on the Labor front bench to sit beside the most talented of the former ministers. In secret ballots, the members of the caucus have clearly promoted men and women who have benefited from the educational opportunities made available by my government. I get the impression that the Liberal, as much as the Labor members of the Federal Parliament, are not impressed by new arrivals promoted by their state executives on the basis of gender, race, religion or faction, rather than merit and potential. At least the Liberal Party in Queensland is bringing back Sir James Killen. A Lancelot, a knight in shining armour, to contest the new seat of Blair. He may be under the illusion that it is named after Sir James Blair, the former Chief Justice of Queensland, not Harold Blair, the Aboriginal singer and activist. It is one seat where the Prime Minister would not hesitate to have the other prospective candidate placed last. Citizens, in its 61 years as our temporary parliament, this modest building came to symbolise Australian parliamentary democracy for the Australian people in a way that its more pretentious successor has not yet achieved. It is interesting to study how the physical nature of the building, its relation to the rest of Canberra, and Canberra's relation to the rest of Australia, affected our style of government. Unlike the Palace of Westminster, for example, this building was the home of the executive as well as the Parliament. The Prime Minister's office was here, never at the Lodge, or Kirribilli. King's Hall was the most democratic meeting place of any modern legislatures anywhere in the world. We lived cheek by jowl with the press gallery. My predecessor as leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party took the innovative step of installing an ensuite in a tiny space formerly occupied by a fold-down bed adjoining the caucus room. The ventilation pipe went directly through the Daily Telegraph room immediately above. This was said to give Alan Reid a special conduit to movements and leaks from the Labour Party. This room, the non-members' dining room, has great and historic associations. It was here on the 26th of March 1942 that General Douglas MacArthur first addressed the nation. Turning to John Gorton, MacArthur said, "Mr. Prime Minister, we too, you and I, will see this thing through together. We shall win or we shall die." In later years, this room was the scene of many memorable jousts between Prime Ministers and opposition leaders when distinguished visitors were entertained at parliamentary luncheons, dinners and receptions. A year ago in the Palace on the Hill, our two leaders spoke in support of the toast to the President of the United States. With a straight face. The President then proposed a toast to the Queen of Australia. Such occasions have the advantage of placing the protagonists on equal terms. I always took the occasions very seriously. I recall in particular the dinner for President Saragat of Italy in 1967. He was the first European head of state to be accorded a parliamentary reception, except for the Queen. But President Saragat was a socialist. After a fairly comprehensive survey of Italo-Australian relations going back to Garibaldi's passage through Bass Strait in 1852, and stressing that my predecessor was Lazzarini and my neighbour Costa, I concluded by saying that although the times seemed grim, it was the height of the Cold War, I was certain that Europe and the world would surmount the challenge of nuclear confrontation. I quoted the words with which the divine Dante concluded the Inferno. E quindi uscimo a rivedere le stelle. As you know, that means then we emerged and saw the stars again. Ladies and gentlemen, they are words from which I take great comfort. I've used them on appropriate occasions over the intervening 30 years. In particular, I use them to encourage supporters of my own party when, as happens from time to time, we find ourselves in adversity. Like Prime Ministers, the parties are not enshrined in the Constitution, but a strong two-party system is the mainstay of parliamentary democracy in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in the United States. The Prime Minister is first and last a party leader. Only the major parties can appoint a Prime Minister and elect a government. This is the great truth recognised and acted upon so superbly by Cheryl Kernow. On this occasion, in this place associated with great successes and reverses, on the anniversary of the end of 23 years of opposition, many of them years of singular barrenness and bitterness, even those of you who are not Labour supporters may indulge an old parliamentary hand. Forgive me if I conclude with a message of confidence for the party which made me Prime Minister of Australia. It is in the same words I used in this room 30 years ago. E quindi uscimo
Arrivederci, Daystele.
Tonight's Prime Minister's lecture can be heard on Radio National tomorrow morning at 9:30. Also repeated on ABC television tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock. Coming up tonight, John Hind presents Suspicion.